Tonight, we are turning our attention to a topic about New York City homeless children and their education. This problem continues to grow, and the number of homeless children in New York City now exceeds over 100,000. This is from a 2021 statistic. Our first speaker is Samantha Shapiro, who is a contributing journalist to the New York Times Magazine. She wrote a story, Children in the Shadows, New York City's Homeless Children, which was published in the New York Times Magazine in 2020. This is an incredibly informative and interesting story. I'm going to put a link in the chat feature as she's talking, so you can download and read this. I think you'll find it really fascinating. Besides from doing this article, her stories have been widely translated and syndicated internationally. She has won Best Feature for the Education Writers Association and was a finalist for the National Magazine Award. She is currently an O'Brien Fellow at Marquette University. Our second speaker is Jennifer Pringle. She is the director of Project LIT, Learners in Temporary Housing, a division of Advocates for Children of New York. She's been working since 2002 with this organization to help students experiencing homelessness access educational services and other support they need to succeed in school. She received her undergraduate degree from Dartmouth College and her law degree from Columbia Law School. Each of our presenters will speak for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. Afterwards, we will have a short Q&A. If you have a question, please type your question into the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And if the question is directed directly to a particular person, please include her name. So without further ado, I want to turn this over. Samantha will start us off, and followed by Jennifer. Take it away.
Thank you, Joanna. And thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I mentioned that I'm a little bit under the weather, so I apologize in advance if this is not super sharp, but I'm recovering from COVID a little bit. So I thought Jennifer Pringle is, such a knowledgeable expert about this issue that I thought it might be interesting or helpful to share a little bit about how I got interested in writing about this topic. Basically, when my son started kindergarten, he made a best friend, and it was his first friend, and it was, a big deal. And this friend who is mentioned in the story, he's called Jay, had been left back because he was having some trouble with reading. So he was a little older than the other kids in the class. My son was a little younger. My son was very intense, very spirited, big feelings. And Jay was very calm, very easygoing, very popular. And they just had this lovely relationship. And we were very close, with the family. And Jay lived with his sister and his mom on the top floor of a house that was owned by an elderly woman. And his mom helped out with some chores and paid a small amount of rent. And she received some benefits. And they got by just fine. They were doing great. His sister was attending a special school for kids who have dyslexia. His mom had dyslexia and hadn't graduated from high school. So she had some trouble getting, the kind of work that you need to pay New York City rents. So a developer bought this house, and then the family was kind of stuck because they didn't make enough money to pay rent in New York City. And they received a housing voucher through a program that is meant to keep families in the place that they are for about $1,500. And they searched high and low, and they could not find anyone who would take the voucher. I mean, it's very hard to find an apartment for $1,500 in New York City, but landlords are also not very interested in accepting these vouchers. So she worked with legal aid, she called the city councilman, she did everything she possibly could do. Other families in the neighborhood tried to find her a place, and it became clear that there was no way to stay basically in the neighborhood. There was no option. So the next step was interfacing with the Department of Homeless Services, which is a massive billion, $3.2 billion, $3.5 billion department in New York City. And so in order for her to get placed in a shelter, she couldn't go to she couldn't, for example, stay at our house for a night. She had to go directly from being evicted to the intake center for the Department of Homeless Services. And so she sort of anxiously, then when she thought that the eviction marshal was going to come, she pulled the kids out of school. She got everything ready because as soon as she had the notice, she wanted to go and get placed as soon as possible. At that point, I said, you know what, since I've understood that people have to wait at this intake center for sometimes days, why don't we have Jay and his sister stay in our house so they can continue to go to school and don't have to have this kind of go all the way to the Bronx and wait for days and maybe sleep over in some area. And so Jay's mom, who we call May in the story, said, oh no, like the kids have to be there the entire time. This process could take days. The kids actually have to miss school in order for her to get housing. And that was kind of the first moment where I just became really aware of how out of step the kind of whole homeless system is with the educational needs of students. Because of course you would never require a child to miss school to sit in like the equivalent of the DMV, right? If you didn't have to, you'd never make that choice as a parent, as a caregiver. So what happened from there was that the kids had to go to this place, they had to sit there all day, they had to get taken on a school bus to sleep in some apartment with a bare mattress, they had to come back, they had to wait longer. Then the system placed them in a temporary shelter. They weren't in an official homeless shelter in the far Bronx. We live in South Brooklyn. That's where both kids' schools are. So there's no way for them to get to school. And because they were in a temporary homeless situation, they weren't officially homeless, the city wasn't required to provide the kids busing. And they didn't know how long they would be there. So for weeks, the kids stayed in this place where they knew nobody and couldn't go to school. And missing that much school in and of itself is a big deal for many children. Missing weeks of school is a serious issue. You get very far behind, and both kids had some learning issues already. So they eventually were placed in another shelter in the Bronx. They were enrolled in school there. The other child was commuting maybe almost an hour and a half each way to go to her school for kids with special needs. And this saga continued to unfold. Basically, they ended up switching schools, I think 3 times in that year. And on a personal note, not to in any way compare, but my son's best friend just kind of disappeared one day, basically, from school. And I and the other, parents of his friends had no way to kind of explain what was happening because it was completely unclear what was happening. We didn't know if he was going to be gone for a day. We didn't know if he was gone permanently, and to put children in a situation like that where things are it's completely unknown where they're going to be is obviously, very traumatic. And I kind of, to a degree, obviously at a remove, sort of lived through each stage of uncertainty, each, kind of trauma that this child faced. And I knew the family well enough to know that they had exhausted all the options. It wasn't as though they were doing something, they had missed something. Like, this was really how the system worked. And this is how the system works for the over 100,000 children in New York City who are homeless. Meaning that it's the shelter system that we have in the city is very unique. New York City is the only city in the United States that has a right to shelter. meaning that people do have a right to literally have shelter, which is different than a right to housing. So we have this huge shelter system, but in a way, it kind of replaces a system of affordable housing in which someone lives in a permanent place, because the people in the homeless shelter system are kind of nomadic. They get moved at a moment's notice, they get moved unpredictably, and that has really serious consequences for children's education, because anytime a child switches schools, there's research that shows they fall behind a certain amount. Kids in the homeless shelter system can switch schools multiple times a year. They can't, form relationships with their teachers. They can't get their IEPs met immediately, because those transitions take a really big toll. And broadly, the pattern that a lot of homeless students fall into is they fall so far behind in elementary years, like my son's friend, that they then cannot catch up and they drop out of high school, like my son's friend mother did. And the biggest predictor of future homelessness is not getting a high school diploma. So it's a really terrible cycle. And since I wrote this story, I have been really, really interested in the issue, and I am now focusing on rural homeless students. So one thing that's kind of become more clear to me now that I'm not looking at New York City is what an enormous system we do have. Many places just have nothing, and we do have this right to shelter. So it, in a certain way, makes it a little more striking how poorly the system we have does serve students' educational needs. And I think, Jennifer Pringle, who's going to speak next, I think she will probably speak better than I can to some of the specifics about New York City right now. So I think that I'll turn it over to her right now, if that's okay.
Thank you, Samantha. I think that's great. I'm fascinated by how you've done so much and then researched this so well. Thank you. I'll be glad to know what Jennifer has to say.
Thank you, Samantha. And I think your report, I just want to thank you for your reporting on this and shining a light on this important issue, because I think in New York City, as you all well know, there's a lot of attention about adults experiencing homelessness, seeing people who seem unhoused on the streets. But because family homelessness is not, you're not directly confronted with that, it's easy to forget how huge an issue this is in New York City, how enormous it is, how you can be sitting on a subway car and see a family who has a rolly suitcase with them and no, they're not going on vacation. They're headed on their way to PATH, the intake center up in the Bronx, to apply for shelter. And we just don't see them. And it's, as Samantha was pointing out, we've developed a system that of shelter, and I'm going to go into to share some data points with you, the kind of boring stuff, but we've developed a system that systematically deprioritizes the education of children. So not only is it not prioritizing the education of children, but it's actually harming their ability to effectively access education and educational opportunities. I'm going to share my screen and go through some data with you all. Please feel free to jump in with questions in the chat as I go through this. So here is a map of the city. As you can see, I mean, again, I'm sure this is not surprising to any of you. Homelessness doesn't impact all of the communities in the city in the same way. There's a concentration of students experiencing homelessness in central Brooklyn and South Bronx. There's been a 42% increase in family homelessness. and student homelessness. Just to give you an example, 1 in 7 students in the Bronx experience homelessness. So these numbers all represent school districts, the community school districts, and the darker the color, the higher incidence of student homelessness there. On this next slide are some outcomes, academic outcomes. So only 29% of students who are homeless are proficient in reading, which is 20 percentage points lower than the rate of permanently housed students, 29%. 60% of students in shelter graduate from high school in 4 years, 22 percentage points lower than their permanently housed peers. And again, as Samantha mentioned, having a high school diploma is the #1 factor associated with reducing your risk of experiencing homelessness as a young adult. So young people who drop out of high school are 4.5 times more likely to experience homelessness. So again, like when we're talking about ending the cycle of homelessness, and if you want a preventive, proactive approach, we really need to look at education. 64% of students were chronically absent, and chronic absenteeism is defined as missing 10% or more of the school year. So that's roughly 3 weeks or more of school. And that rate is 36 percentage points higher than their permanently housed peers. Now, I just want to stop for a second, just because I referenced students who are homeless and students in shelter. We have a federal education law called the McKinney-Vento Act, and it protects students experiencing homelessness, and it defines homelessness somewhat broadly. It includes those in temporary doubled up situations, as well as those living in shelter. It also covers some other types of temporary housing arrangements, but those two tend to be the biggest buckets. The reason for that is because let's say you get evicted from your home and you're temporarily staying with someone else, that student would be protected by the McKinney-Vento Act and be able to stay in their same school and get additional supports there. Another thing that's important to know, because we are a right to shelter city, and with the growth in family homelessness, we now have over, get this, 200 family shelters in the city. Over 200 family shelters in the city. And there are 3 different shelter systems. There's the largest, it's operated by the Department of Homeless Services. And then we also have a shelter system operated by the Human Resources Administration called the HRA, referred to as HRA, that operates their domestic violence shelters. We also have runaway and homeless youth shelters. And there's also 2 other smaller systems. There's also the 3 shelters run by Housing Preservation and Development, and a very small family shelter system operated by the HIV/AIDS Services Administration. So as you can tell by all these acronyms and names, there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. And as you can imagine, the emphasis is around moving families into permanent housing. But oftentimes that comes at the cost of a child's education. And the average length of stay now in shelter is 18 months. 18 months. So that's 2 school years you're talking about. So it's an incredibly long time in the life of a student. And instead of this being an opportunity for a shelter system to help get supports in place and, address educational challenges that the student may have and stabilize it, oftentimes shelter stay is a destabilizing factor for students that throws them off course, that sets them further behind. I want to share some of the initiatives the DOE had, that Department of Education. I always get in trouble for using acronyms, so excuse me if I jump into my jargon, but the Department of Education has launched some initiatives to support students experiencing homelessness, and just want to call attention to them. One is now students in grades kindergarten through 6th grade who are living in shelter are guaranteed yellow bus service. As Samantha alluded to, and as any of you have read and, local coverage about busing, school bus service has some significant problems, and especially this year where there's been a shortage in drivers. Nevertheless, students in shelter in grades K to 6th grade are guaranteed yellow bus service. But 40% of families are placed in shelter outside of the borough where their kids go to school. So although they may get bus service, sometimes it's, a parent is told that, yes, you can get bus service, but only if you can get your kid to the bus stop by 5:45 in the morning. And it makes for a tremendously long commute. So parents are oftentimes placed in this position of like, I want my child to stay connected to their friends, their teachers, their school, but how am I going to make this work? How can I put my kid through, an hour and a half, 2-hour ride each way, getting back and forth to school? And what if I have an appointment? I mean, another thing that's also that that many people don't know is that, so you're placed in a shelter, oftentimes in a different borough from where you're from, and no one's allowed into your shelter unit. So any support system that you may have had, any extended family that maybe helped out with childcare, they're not allowed into your unit. And you're not allowed to spend the night at their house. Let's say you want to take a weekend and have a break. There are rules about requesting a pass to leave the shelter. So it's this incredibly restrictive environment where you're cut off from these systems of support. And, you can understand why, these policies are in place. You don't want people who haven't been vetted by the Department of Homeless Services entering into units. So on one level, I understand that, but for an individual family, you think about how things come up. You have to run to an appointment. A meeting and an appointment takes longer than you thought. There's no safety net to help catch you when those things come up. And how this plays out is that kids miss more school. Okay. Another thing that the Department of Education also expanded access to Metrocards. Previously, parents had to pick up weekly Metrocards. Now they can get monthly Metrocards to take their kids back and forth to school in those cases where they're not using the busing. The Department of Education also hired more staff to work in schools that had a disproportionate number of students experiencing homelessness in them, including 100 social workers and 100 coordinators. The issue with that, though, is that many schools, we have 1,600 schools in New York City, and most schools do not have a Bridging the Gap social worker or a students in temporary housing coordinator, which means that, I think 3 out of 4 students in shelter attend a school that has neither of those supports. So what's not, I've already touched on some of these points. In terms of the attendance, the reading and the graduation rates, lack of coordination. Again, to point the second point here, oftentimes parents are told, you need to go to this housing appointment, which means, again, you're taking your child out of school. I mentioned about the staffing. there's still the same number of shelter-based supports that have been there for almost 20 years, even though the number of families experiencing homelessness has gone up dramatically. There's also vacant positions that the DOE hasn't filled, even though it has the funding to do so. I mentioned about the families being placed in shelter in a different borough. And then, as Samantha alluded to, when you're faced with these long commutes, families often decide to transfer to a local school. Well, middle and high schools that have seats available mid-year tend to be the lower performing schools. So when their educational opportunities are also diminished if they decide to transfer. The city has made shelter transfers available for educational reasons. So a family can request a shelter transfer to be closer to their child's school, but it's not systematically made available. And it's really, honestly, that in my experience, it's been families that have had to pretty vigorously advocate for those types of transfers. And then, again, the type of information and support, in terms of accessing special education services, in terms of navigating the high school admissions process, like families don't have that available to them in shelter. So as a result, given that lack of investment and vision and coordination, the outcomes that we're getting are not surprising. So what can we do about it? One of the things that Advocates for Children is pushing for is for the city to launch an interagency initiative to bring together Department of Homeless Services, Department of Education, Administration for Children's Services, and other city agencies, and have them look at their policies, see how those policies are impacting kids, particularly their attendance, and set ambitious goals and hold the different agencies accountable to addressing those policy barriers and ultimately reduce absenteeism and increase educational success. Again, as I mentioned, why is the Department of Homeless Services placing 40% of families in a different borough from where their kids go to school? If we target if agencies are forced to focus their attention on these issues, then we believe that significant progress can be made. Another issue is addressing what kind of support is available to children and families in shelter. We're calling on the city to hire 150 shelter-based community coordinators. So right now, the city is in the process of finalizing its plan to use $24 million in federal COVID relief funds through the American Rescue Plan, specifically for students experiencing homelessness. And we're calling on the city to use that funding to hire shelter-based staff, even if it's only time limited. There's so much that can be done in the next couple of years to make sure that students and families have that support needed, because it really takes that kind of targeted, focused attention. And this is not something that just Advocates for Children is calling on. There's several other organizations, advocacy groups, shelter providers, other stakeholders who believe this is really what's needed. And we have the opportunity right now with this federal education funding to really focus in on this and provide some needed supports for families in shelter. Okay, I know that was a lot, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and see if there are any questions. Isn't the answer permanent housing for families? Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I'm not, we definitely need more affordable housing. And periods of homeless, when a family experiences homelessness, it should not disrupt their child's education. And, you know, so if we want to make sure the next generation doesn't experience homelessness, we have to make sure that the kids right now who are in shelter get the needed support so they can be successful.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, I want to ask you, Samantha, have you kept in touch with Prince? Is that the boy's name? I know you're not in the city anymore, from what you said, but I'm just curious to know during all of this, he sounded very bright. I know he did well in math, but I would think all of these stresses must be very hard on even brilliant students.
I am actually in the city, but I am focusing
are in
on
the
rural students right now. I have been intermittently in touch. Something interesting that happened after my article was published was I received a fair amount of contact from people who wanted to specifically help the families in the story. And I know that they all received assistance after the story came out in certain ways. It was interesting for me as a journalist because it made me feel like the piece may not have connected all the dots well enough, because of course helping 3 families is incredibly wonderful, but it's not for those 3 families there's tens of thousands more aren't getting that help.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of questions that have just popped up. Do all of the family shelters now have Wi-Fi access for the students? I guess
all of the family shelters in the DHS system, except for one, and the DV system, except for their dwellings, now have access to Wi-Fi. The runaway homeless youth and the housing HPD shelters, the housing preservation and development shelters, do not have Wi-Fi for students. And this is not going to be surprising to y'all. This is not like super high speed Wi-Fi. So we definitely have heard of students who still struggle to access, some of the more streaming things like that take up more broadband. But there has been significant improvements with in the family shelter system in terms of access to Wi-Fi.
That's before you go into the other questions, and I know there are a lot. I'm curious to know, there are several departments that seem to be dealing with it, so it's kind of piecemeal. How is the budget going on these? Are these being cut, or there's more money being given? The reason I'm asking, I deal with elder care, and every time there's a budget, it's being slashed. And here's like older people are not important. And it sounds to me a little bit like homeless children aren't that important.
Well, so as a part of the third round of federal stimulus funding, the American Rescue Plan, the Congress carved out $800 million for students specifically for students experiencing homelessness. And New York City is getting roughly $33 million. They have already received and have a plan for $9 million. And part of that initial first phase of funding is to hire 50 community coordinators for shelters, which we're thrilled about, which is great. But with over 200 shelters, we don't think it's enough. As I mentioned, the Department of Education is working on its plan for the second round of funding, which is $24 million. Their draft plan right now includes a second year of funding for those original 50 community coordinators. They have until the end of the month to submit their plan to the state. And we are vigorously advocating that they include additional staffing in that. Their current plan includes 15 different initiatives. They're very piecemeal. I don't, some of the largest investments are around data platform expansion. Data platforms are great, but if there's not staffing to use the platform, that type of investment will be a waste of money. And that's what we're seeing right now. We partner with shelters. They have a weekly attendance report and no one's looking at it. So it's not a matter of accessing the data. The data is there. They need someone who has the skill set, who has the responsibility, who's compensated to get that data report and identify, triage, look at, filter it, figure out which students are struggling with attendance, and proactively reach out to those families and provide support. Currently, the DOE has family assistance in shelter. The starting salary for a family assistant is $28,000. They are not paid to have that skill set to do that. They're just not. So it is, I think, a fool's errand to think that someone in that position is going to be responsible for turning around the rate of chronic absenteeism in shelter. So, and, there's been talk, shelter staff will use the new data platform. Shelter staff are struggling right now just to move families into permanent housing. And there is significant turnover with shelter staff. So I think it's, I think it is relying on them to implement something like this again, I think is misguided.
Okay, there's another couple of questions here. One of them is, are any private social service organizations working with homeless children issues specifically? I guess that's you.
Advocates for, there's a lot of, there's the shelters are operated by nonprofits. So if you're talking about education specifically, Advocates for Children focuses on education issues, but there's CAMBA, Help USA, WIN, a bunch of different social service, nonprofits that operate shelters. They're not specifically focused on, they're shelter providers. They provide family shelter services.
Okay. And how about here, another one is, how can groups like the League work to help? Advocating at City Hall in Albany, it sounds like there's more a budget than a legislative challenge. I can certainly put you all in touch with our policy director. We definitely we do sign-on letters to call on groups to lend their support around our advocacy. For example, things like using the federal funding to hire community coordinators. I think to me, it's drawing attention to this in the advocacy. So, when you think about some of these, school reform efforts, how is this going to impact students experiencing homelessness? How is this, like a lot of the conversations around, we're making school choice more accessible to families. Well, if a family doesn't have
a device or email, like how are they going to access that? If there's not, so you know, we try, I think in your group, we could, like I said, I can certainly put you in touch with our policy director and loop you in around some of those efforts. But I think it's like, what are you doing to ensure that students experiencing homelessness get the supports and services they need? This can't be forgotten.
Yeah, it just sounds like a really tough situation. There was another question, I believe. It seems that the rule prioritizes the procedure of the best child's development. Do you know how much each homeless person family costs the city? Has that number increased?
I don't know how much it is currently, the cost per unit. Samantha, maybe you know through your reporting how much it is.
While I don't have that number, I do know that the city comptroller has repeatedly flagged the Department of Homeless Services as having increased its budget. I think it was like 148%. That's not the exact number, while getting not good results. Well, not good outcomes. And I do recall when I was reporting the piece in New York City, families who met the McKinney-Vento definition of homeless, but were not in the shelter system, like they were sleeping on someone's floor, or they were moving from couch to couch. They actually had better educational outcomes than kids in the homeless system, meaning like the kids who the city was actively spending money on were having worse outcomes than just basically being on their own. That's what I recall.
I think that's probably true. If you have to drag a kid out of school every time you have to go to the administrator to put you in another shelter, your child's education is being disrupted. Sounds like a no-win situation. Let's see if there's anything else here. Here's another new message. Oh, this is for Samantha. Do you read this? What are you learning about the challenges for unhoused children in rural areas versus New York City? And 2, virtual remote learning has been mentioned as a possible solution. Seems incredibly challenging for any unhoused family to navigate.
Well, those are 2 complicated questions. I guess I'm going to start with the second one. I don't think virtual remote learning is any kind of a solution. The primary way, especially outside of New York City, in rural areas, the primary way that homeless families are accessing any kind of services is through schools. And the primary way they're being identified is through schools. This is actually a pretty important point, and one that I'm exploring in greater depth right now. But the way that HUD identifies homeless people is through something called a point in time count, where they literally walk around and see who is unsheltered. That is very different than the way schools identify homeless students. The definition for schools is much broader, and it includes people who may be doubled up, who may be living in a completely uninhabitable housing structure, which is something I'm seeing a lot in rural areas, who may be living in a trailer with no electricity, who may be in a very dangerous situation, maybe living in a campground. So those people count as homeless because they don't have a stable place to live. And under HUD, those people don't count as homeless. So schools are doing something very important in just identifying, even though they're not identifying everyone, and even though it's not a perfect system, schools are identifying a much broader population that is unstably housed. So if school is remote, I mean, what I've found through my reporting is that they just can't identify the families, because it's not like families are going to show up somewhere and present themselves. Many families are identified because the school bus driver sees that he's now picking people up. This is something I literally just saw, like in front of basically like a trash heap. Like, so he's like, well, I think these people qualify as homeless. So and that whole identification system does not occur if there's a remote. also in, the reporting that I'm doing now, some students are unaccompanied. They basically don't have parents. And so they're not gonna log on to, they're trying to find housing from night to night. They're not gonna log on. They may show up at school where, especially in the areas that I'm now reporting on, in rural areas at school, they may be getting a shower, they may be getting clothes, they may be getting toiletries, they're getting food, and they're not just getting school lunch and breakfast, they're getting like take home food for the weekend. So it's like this whole hub for them that remote learning, I mean, to me, it's like not even something that I don't think it would solve the needs of homeless students. That's my personal opinion. And I think in terms of the first question, what I'm learning about the challenges for unhoused children in rural areas is, as I said, in rural areas, there aren't even services, there aren't even shelters. So in a certain way, they're kind of like behind New York City, even though what we've presented, or I think Jennifer and I have shared, is that New York City is not doing great. But there are some kind of interesting ideas in rural areas that some of the solutions people can come up with may be more innovative than the kind of very bureaucratic and kind of traumatic system that we have in New York City. Like, they can be less traumatic, they can be more kind of communal and less stigmatizing than the homeless shelter system that we have in major cities can be. So that's something interesting that I'm learning about. Sorry if that was a long answer.
And just to build off of what Samantha was sharing, so families can't even apply for housing support until they've been in shelter for 90 days. Like, basically telling family, you can't go anywhere. We will not help you at all for 90 days. And only on 90 days will we start applying for city FEPs and, housing support and helping with your housing application. So that's one thing. And then also on the front door aspect of it, yes, we have a right to shelter, but we only have a right to shelter if you can prove that you don't have any housing resources. So families have to document where they've lived for the last 2 years, every place they've lived, contact information for all those people, and why they can't go back there. And if they don't provide sufficient documentation, then they're denied eligibility. So and that 90-day clock doesn't start until they've been found eligible for shelter. So you have families reapplying for shelter, which just prolongs their stay in shelter because, again, that clock doesn't start ticking until they're found eligible. So, like, back to Samantha's point about whereas you tell people from, I don't know, the Southern Tier or the Catskills area, like, that this is how we've set up they look like you have two heads. Like, why in the world would the city want to pay for 6 months of shelter when we walk in the door, the first thing we're doing is screening for eligibility for housing supports. Like, when you go into Department of Social Services and apply for benefits, like, we don't want you in our shelters any longer than you have to be. Whereas in New York City, it's almost like we're trying to draw it out to discourage people from coming in, which, as you see by the numbers, that's not working.
Yes, I think both of you are making it very clear that this is a very, very upsetting and very complicated situation. And these are issues that really have to be addressed very seriously. And I think it's good that you brought this out. Samantha, it sounds like you're working on some kind of possible article dealing with homelessness again. When you have it, if you'd let me know, you have my email, Legal Women Voters email address, or I'll send it to you again. And the same to you, Jennifer. I know that you could send me the information on what we might be able to do, I will send it on to the different people who probably can pass this on, because I again think this is just such an incredibly difficult and needy situation, and really there isn't enough what's the word, attention put to this, and I really appreciate it. By the way, I want you to know this program is being videotaped and will be, when it's completed, Natalie, our administrative assistants, will put it on our website. I will let you know if any one of you wants to have a copy of it or to watch it. Perhaps it can be used in another context at some time. So unless you have any additional things to tell us that might be helpful going forward. No, this has been great. Both of you have been terrific. I really appreciate you spending this time with us and giving us a little more insight into this very important situation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Good night.